Welcome to Communication Design 1 online lecture for week 1. Hope everyone's having a good week. For this lecture, we're going to discuss resolution. We're going to discuss pixels, raster and vector images and the difference. We're also going to go into Photoshop, look at resampling and resizing regarding resolution. We're going to discuss color modes, cropping, rotating, and save versus save as. So when we talk about resolution, what is resolution exactly? So resolution is the detail an image holds. And in Photoshop, what we're majorly working with are images. So an image resolution is typically described in pixels per inch, or PPI, which refers to how many pixels are displayed per inch of an image. The more pixels you have in an image, the higher the quality and the higher the resolution. Quality or resolution in the image is often dictated by how many pixels are contained in an inch of that image, and that's the PPI. It also relates to the overall dimensions of the image, which is also expressed as pixels. So that information, those pixels, cannot be created by Photoshop. That is part of, it's native to the image. It's how the image was originally photographed. How the image was originally scanned determines how many pixels are in that image. So higher resolution will mean there is more image detail in the image, or there are more pixels per inch. With the more pixels per inch, that means there's more information in that image, and that shows as a high quality, crisp image. Low resolution means the image has fewer pixels, and there's less information in the image. So it's not as high quality, it's not very crisp. Sometimes it's just even smaller with a low resolution image. You end up having to reduce the size because it's actually just a smaller image because there are fewer pixels. When we talk about pixels, they're the tiny little squares of color that form part of a multifaceted image. So if you look at an image in Photoshop or in any digital programs, those images are made up of those little squares of color, and that is what forms an image. That continuous image that's formed is because of those pixels. So right here, this is a zoomed in image of an image in Photoshop, and it's showing you the individual pixels. If you were to zoom out, you would see a continuous tone that's creating that photograph. Pixels are also make up the image on computer screens or any display screen, such as TVs or computer monitors. You'll hear displays described as having a resolution of 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. That means the screen will have a width of 1920 pixels and a height of 1080 pixels. So in images, the pixels per inch is the unit of measurement, and the more pixels there are, that's more information in the image, and that makes the image look more real or accurate. Conversely, on a TV monitor or a computer monitor, the more pixels per inch, the higher quality that monitor will be, and the better your image will look. And so that's when you think of going to buy a computer monitor or a TV, you'll hear that described, because that's how the display screen is made up of pixels. So PPI is used in Photoshop, PPI pixels per inch, because when you're in Photoshop and you're looking at an image, the image is comprised of pixels. And so PPI means pixels per inch contained in an inch of a digital image file. Conversely, you'll also hear the term DPI, which means dots per inch. And that actually refers to how many dots of ink are dropped down when printing a file. So if you were a designer creating a publication and you send it to a printer, they will talk about dots per inch because that's how many dots of ink are put down. And you can see on the right, that's a close-up of a print showing the overlay of ink drops to form that image. And that's in contrast to the image on the left, which is pixels per inch, showing the individual pixels making up that computer image. So you'll hear those two. Sometimes people will use them interchangeably, but there is a difference. Another way of thinking of pixels, we can compare it to the pointillism technique, made famous by the French post-impressionist painters Georges Seurat. This is one of his most famous paintings that's on display at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's from 1884. You can see in the inset on the left that the images, you can see the close-up. So when you look at it close up, you're seeing a lot of color blocks. He's laying down paint with his brush, forming these dots with his paint. But when you zoom out and you look at the image as a whole on the right, now you're seeing the form created in the sense of the trees and the barge at the back and the water. So, that's just another way of thinking pixels can be compared to that pointillism technique. So this leads us to a discussion of raster versus vector imagery. Now, when we use Photoshop, Photoshop is primarily a resolution-dependent program. An image in Photoshop is bound by the resolution assigned to it. Photoshop uses raster images, which are comprised of individual pixels of color. Each pixel contributes to the overall image. Pixels are the smallest element in a raster image. So a raster image is just a two-dimensional image that is a rectangular grid of square pixels viewable on a computer screen. It can also be printed on paper or any other medium used to display it. Raster images are complex, multicolored visuals. They can include gradients as well. And they create raster images are that continuous tone that you see like in photographs. They can be very complex. You've seen, photographs that are very large. They're continuous tone. They have gradients. But a major part of photographs is that they can be scaled down, but not up, because you cannot create more pixels than the image originally contained. So photographs are raster images, and digital cameras create raster images. We can also scan photos on a scanner and create an image that way. And depending on how you scanned the image and what settings you chose and how many pixels you chose as your settings, you could have chosen to scan it at 300 dpi. You could have chosen to scan it at 600 dpi. And so you're inputting that data in there to create that scan, and you're saying how many pixels that image will have. Same with the digital camera. You can change your settings so that each time you take a photo, it can be a very large photo. You can determine how many pixels per inch and that dimension of the photo that you want. So a lot of times when designers set up photo shoots because they need specific imagery for whatever campaign they're working on or publication they might be working on, they will tell the photographer that they want the highest resolution possible. So that photographer will make sure that when he's working with his settings in his camera, he chooses the largest file size available. So when he takes the photo in the digital camera, the output is going to be the highest resolution possible. So that's a big part of images in Photoshop. You cannot add information. So what you have in the photo is what you are going to end up using, because raster images can be scaled down, but they cannot be scaled up because you cannot create more pixels than the image originated with. Now, opposite of raster, before we go to that, let me also show you this example. So images with lower resolutions have fewer pixels, as we've discussed. So if the image is sized up, those few pixels become visible as seen to the right. This is an excerpt from an article that is included in your online learning for this week. This image was obviously a very small image, and so this person wanted to scale it up, but when he or she did that, the image ended up pixelating, and so you're actually seeing the pixels enlarging, and you're seeing those pixels becoming visible rather than comprising a continuous tone in an image. So that's an issue with raster images. That's what happens when you scale up but do not have the information available. Those pixels stretch. So you're seeing the pixels rather than what you would want would be a continuous toned image. So that's a great example of why we don't want to scale up. And when you start working in Photoshop, you'll notice that. If you start working with images and you want to scale up, you're going to lose quality because it's a raster image and you cannot make more information. So the raster images can be scaled down and not lose image quality. On the opposite of raster is vector. Now, you've probably worked with some of the core Adobe programs, Adobe Illustrator, Adobe InDesign, and Adobe Photoshop. So we're going to be focusing on Photoshop in this course. But if you remember the times that you may have used Adobe Illustrator, the art you create in Illustrator is primarily vector. It's resolution independent. What this means is when I print from Illustrator, the image will print to the highest available resolution of the printing device that I'm printing to. The only setback of printing anything from Illustrator is what the printer quality might be. Because Illustrator, any image in Illustrator can be scaled up infinitely. So the only way that you could have an issue scaling anything up infinitely in Illustrator is that the printer you may be using has limitations. But if you're using large format printer, when you think of large signage, billboards, that information a lot of times is been created in Illustrator and can be scaled up infinitely to create those large signage that you see. So Illustrator uses paths and they retain their appearance regardless of size, so they can be upscaled infinitely up. Vector graphics in Illustrator are comprised of line art, shapes, etc. Vector is great for logos, for illustrations, for product artwork, for signage. So if you think of corporations, they'll want to do their logos in Illustrator because you can scale it up infinitely. So if you think of any company that may be like an 18-wheeler, they put their logo on that huge 18-wheeler and the logo is in Illustrator, so you can scale it up and it can print as large as possible. Billboards, huge signage. When you go to a concert and you see things on those huge screens, all of that can a lot of times is done in Illustrator, because if you want something very specific like your logo or maybe product artwork, things that are very, you need corporate branding, that you want that brand to be maintained, you'll want to use Illustrator and vector artwork because you want to have the ability to scale up at any time you want. Now, if you're printing from Illustrator, the image will print to the highest available resolution of the printing device used. So if you're doing signage at a conference, a lot of times printers will be using large format printing, and they have the ability you can scale up as far as possible because of the printing device you're printing to. Now, Photoshop can also create vector art, and we will start working on that next week to show you how you can create vector art in Photoshop. And it has the ability to maintain its vector aspect in Photoshop. So we'll go over that, but I want you to be aware that there are differences between flat raster art and vector art. So vector art is resolution independent, whether you're doing it in Illustrator or in Photoshop or any other program. If it's vector, it's resolution independent. So let's go next to lab time in Photoshop.